Okay. I think I've got it figured out. All right, so let's talk argument here. I want to give you plenty of time to read your next assignment because it is considerably longer. So let's start about talking about argument according to Ramage, Bean, and Johnson. So yesterday we were talking what argument is and what argument is not. So according to your textbook and your notes, what have you learned about what an argument is or what it isn't? Okay, so it's not a fight, quarrel, or pro-con debate. None of these are complex enough for that, right? And argument shouldn't necessarily have to have a negative connotation, right? So it says argument does not imply anger. I feel myself like physically relaxing when I hear that. Like, we don't define argument as something that would imply anger. All right. What can arguments be, or what types of arguments have we looked at so far in this section? Okay. What is an explicit argument?
Argument that directly states its controversial claims.
Did I get that right? Is that what you said? Okay. What about an implicit argument? How does it differ?
Argument, in contrast, it may not look like an argument at all. So, like a bundle sticker.
So an implicit argument is an argument that implies its claims rather than stating them. So basically that means the reader or the audience has to supply the message, right? They have to kind of like figure it out. Implicit arguments are often visual arguments, right? Political cartoons, you have to have some context in order to understand them because they are not saying directly what they mean. Instead, they're implying what they mean, and you are providing that explicit meaning yourself. As a matter of fact, there is a famous news website that has cartoonists who draw a cartoon, and then they have people supply a caption for it. And that caption can be funny, political, apolitical, random, whatever. But the idea there is like the argument is implied, which means anybody could provide that caption. Implied arguments can also, like, they require context and can be misunderstood. An explicit argument will never be misunderstood because it will tell you exactly what it means. For the purposes of this course, you will be dealing with explicit arguments. Why do you think that is? That's what writing papers is, right? Like, you say what you mean. Or at least that's the idea, is to say what you mean as opposed to imply what you mean. When you get papers, speeches, ideas where people are implying what they mean but not actually saying what they mean, sometimes that can get frustrating because, like, it's easy to misunderstand that meaning, or it requires additional context that you may or may not have. With implicit arguments, they assume that you have that context, right? They assume that that context is something you already have. Otherwise, you're not the audience, right? So sometimes it's a matter of finding out you are or you are not the audience. But implicit arguments can be really effective still. So we're going to talk about them briefly before moving on to the idea of more explicit arguments. Do you have any more notes that you had that I don't have included here? It's a pretty short, sweet thought, though that's not the actual definition of argument. As a matter of fact, your textbook authors shy away from giving you one specific official definition of argument. Did anyone write that down? On page 2, they say, at the outset of a book on argument, we ought to explain what an argument is. Instead, we're going to explain why no universally accepted definition is possible. So I love how they're like, this is probably what we should do, but seeing as how we can't, based on the research and the history of argumentation. By the way, that history is often called rhetoric, right? Rhetoric and in our case, composition. They say they can't do a specific one definition because people have disagreed about what it means. And so they're going to introduce you to those controversies in order to kind of come to a working definition, something that can change over time, and something that probably has even changed at least slightly since this textbook. So we're going to do a definition of sorts where we talk about what it is, what it isn't, and what works in different rhetorical situations. You can't make the same argument in any given paper. And by same, I don't mean topic, I mean the same type of argument. The same type of argument doesn't work for the same type of audience and doesn't work for the same writer every time, which is why you're going to learn how to do an evaluation argument. You're going to learn how to do a literary argument. You're going to learn how to do a proposal. You're going to learn how to respond to a resistant audience. All of those will require you to use argument in different ways. So if it's frustrating that they don't give a definition, know that each of your papers will kind of address one of those possibilities. All right, let's check out some implicit arguments. So this is definitely a dated argument from your book. Let's see if I can get it shared. So back in the day, there was this big thing about banning phthalates, which were like substances that were like potentially harmful in toys from China, etc. You see the date on that is 2005. There was also an argument about toys that contained lead and other products that contained lead from China that were like a big thing. So Trouble in Toyland, Toy Safety Survey, doesn't necessarily tell you that this argument is about phthalates, right? The context here is implied because it looks like they are presenting at a conference or something along those lines. Another example of an implicit argument is on page 4 of your textbook. It's got the baby with a bib that says poison, which what are they implying here? Huh?
The baby's poisonous.
The baby's poisonous?
The man, the poison.
Or he might be eating poison, right? It's a bib. It says stop toxic imports. Protect our kids, stop toxic imports. So the idea here is phthalates are dangerous for children, particularly babies. This is also one of those super emotional arguments where they're like, here's a picture of a dog or a baby to really get your emotions high when you're looking at something. I'm sure you have all seen the Sad Puppy commercial with the Sarah McLachlan song. This is like the most commonly used example in composition and rhetoric classes. It's because that commercial is full of pathos. They want you to be sad, right? Because if you are sad, perhaps you will take action. And that's the idea there. So implicit arguments do not work for, I guess, if you want people to really do something immediately and not have to supply extra context, because they're like, won't you help a poor animal today? Like, that's literally what they say, right? So there's the idea behind that. If you look on the next page, this argument is actually an explicit argument. It is a letter to the editor, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but it says, I urge you to reject AB 1108 and allow your health and safety experts, not legislators, to make judgments about the chemicals in our environment based on facts, not fear. So it says exactly what he wants his governor to do. And this was in California at the time when Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor, the governator. So maybe this dates this book, but it also gives you some pretty good ideas still of what explicit arguments look like. So he starts immediately by stating his stake in the argument. Sorry, trying to get this where you can see it. Starts immediately by saying what his stake in the argument is. He's a physician and a public servant. He's worked in medicine and public health. He says veto phthalates, or veto the bill that would ban the use of compounds used to make vinyl toys. And in this case, I think it was at least a part about phthalates. And it also says this bill isn't taking care of the lead paint in toys issue. So don't do that. So that's an explicit argument. You're going to be doing that. You're going to be writing explicit arguments. You're going to be creating essays that really get to state exactly what they mean. In argument, you don't want to waste any words. You know what I mean? Every word should be important. Every sentence should be important. The single easiest thing to do before you turn a paper in for Comp 2 is to look at every sentence and ask, does this support my argument? Does this support my claim? And if it doesn't, take it out. Which I know sometimes, in the past, you're really trying to add as much as possible, think through as much detail, and you're constantly trying to add. Well, by the time you are second semester senior in high school, first semester freshman in college, they're like, okay, but say what you mean. And anything that doesn't contribute to that shouldn't be there. So we're actually going to do the discussion bit in a second here. I think the implicit arguments are kind of fun. So basically any argument, explicit or implicit, has a message and has an audience, right? It's for somebody, and it is asking them to think or feel a certain way. So we've got figure 1-3 here. And we're going to kind of look through this. So on question number 2, it says, assume that you are explaining explicit arguments to an international exchange student who is not yet familiar with U.S. politics and pop culture. Each of the implicit arguments makes a claim on its audience, trying to get viewers to adopt the arguer's position, perspective, belief, or point of view on an issue. For each argument, we're going to answer the following questions. First one, what conversation does this argument join? What is the issue or the controversy? Some people like to say this as what are the, quote, sides on this particular argument? What is at stake? Now, I realize a lot of your birth dates were probably really close to when some of these arguments were made. So I will supply, as a resident old person, some of the context as needed, right? Because these aren't new arguments. Just keep in mind that these aren't in our current context. You know what I mean? This context is about 2010. Okay. So asking what argument does it join? And then the second thing, it says, what is this argument's claim? Especially if it's not explicit, you are going to make it explicit. So like an implicit argument, this says these colors don't run. I want you to translate that to literally what you think the writer is trying to get across. What do they mean? Don't make it at all figurative. Make it completely and totally literal. So in the case of this, these colors don't run would be, the explicit argument would be something like, the American flag is a symbol of bravery and freedom and not backing down from a fight, as is the national bird, the bald eagle. I want you to be that like specific and that literal, because that's what I get from this argument. These colors don't run. The pun is on running on laundry, but the idea is bravery and freedom and patriotism, right? So you are creating an explicit claim from an implicit argument. So what value, perspective, belief, or position does it ask viewers to adopt, right? And we can get that once we've come up with the explicit claim. What is an opposing or alternative view? What views is the argument pushing against? And lastly, how does the argument try to do its work on the brains or hearts of the audience? If you think back, way back to your ad analysis, consider we have a really intense, all bold, all caps font here with an exclamation point, right? So there's a lot of forcefulness and passion in that message just from the text, right? And it's trying to instill that forcefulness, that bravery and passion in its audience. These are the kinds of things I want you to think through when you're seeing an implicit argument. I'm trying to think if I have any implicit arguments around my room. I guess Rosie the Riveter in the background. We can do it is our implicit claim along with the picture. The explicit claim, at least in its context of World War II, is that women were capable of keeping factories running while men were away at war. And so Rosie was a symbol of that ability to keep America's manufacturing running, right? That was a really long explicit claim. Hopefully you can state it a little more compactly than I have here. But what we are going to do is we're going to take these ABCD questions and we're going to apply them to each of these implicit arguments. And I am going to assign you to each one. I do want to make sure, I know I should update these, and I certainly could, but instead I'm going to give you some context. Figure 1-4, I want you to place that in the context of the Gulf War, the war with Iraq, and the George W. Bush presidency, okay? Because that's the context for that picture. All right. Figure 1-3. Dr. Jack Kevorkian, also known as Dr. Death, was a looming figure in the late 90s and early 2000s. He was a physician who assisted with the suicide of his patients and was put in jail. This is that euthanasia argument that you have probably heard before. And we've got a political cartoon. So that's the context behind that. Jack Kevorkian was a physician famous for doing this and getting convicted of murder. Figure 1-6. Is another political cartoon. And it is summed up kind of in the caption, ethanol versus food. At the time, back in the 90s, early 2000s, ethanol was a very controversial fuel source because of hunger and poverty in other places around the world. Countries were exporting corn and grain to make ethanol when they had people in their own country who were starving. And then the last picture feels so eerily like out of place, you know, because it's commonplace now. But it used to be that airlines did not charge for baggage. This cartoon addresses that controversy when airlines first started charging people to check their bags into the airport. Now that's, again, commonplace. So I will allow you to choose your groups based on the ones you think that you kind of like understand. But I want to make sure we have people in all 4 groups. And I'm going to have you answer questions A, B, C, and D. You're going to create an explicit claim. You're going to figure out who the audience of this is. And you're going to figure out how they are trying to work on or change the beliefs of their audience. So how many would be interested or willing to do the photo in figure 1-4? Cool. Awesome. Nice. You can get together if you want, or you can kind of bounce it off once we get to the end. So you can assign A, B, C, or D to one another if you would like, without actually getting in like one big large group. Figure 1-5, the assisted suicide. Jack could work in one. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Good, that'll work. How about the ethanol versus food one? I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I don't care as long as I've got at least one person for this airplane baggage dilemma. Who is willing to do airplane baggage dilemma for me? They're like, okay, I get it. All right, I got 1 or 2 or 3. Sounds good. So you can get together if you would like, or you can assign each person a different aspect of this. But I want you to be able to thoroughly explain and turn this implicit argument into an explicit one. All right. Cool. Okay, checking out figure 1-4. So let's start with A.
So the conversation that it starts is like, it's like a protest against the war in Iraq, and it's like saying that like we shouldn't like run the world and I don't know, fight like a war that isn't like really ours to fight.
On U.S. soil, yes. So I would say you're absolutely right. This is a protest for the war in Iraq. They were arguing and joining the conversation about whether or not the United States should be fighting wars on foreign soil in general. So when we get these colors, don't run the world, the idea is that is the war worth the time, the money, the foreign intervention? That's the kind of conversation they were entering. And of course, there was a big controversy later on about weapons of mass destruction, where they were, where they weren't. A lot going on during that time, right? This is a big conversation they entered, and I don't think that conversation is even 100% over. People still are discussing what's going on, you know, in the Middle East and the Gulf specifically, right? So even though this photo is old, the conversation is surprisingly ongoing, as is the argument. How about B? Let's see.
Yeah. So the argument's claim, I said, was that, of course, the U.S. doesn't have authority over every country, and that we should get out of this war.
Right. So the U.S. doesn't have authority over every country, and that we should get out of that war. That's a really simple, explicit claim. Good job. Next.
What's the opposing or alternative view? Well, since this is definitely a thing for
being against the war, I guess the opposing view would be that we should be in this war.
Yeah, pro-war in Iraq. And they often called that the fight against terrorism. That would be kind of the opposing views rhetoric would be fighting terrorism, right?
Yes.
Okay, there a last one?
Basically, it's like showing how they're against it because of like the signs of like all the words on it.
Yeah, the argument is made through the signs, through the flag itself, right? U.S. Symbols.
The people who are like walking against.
Yeah, and they look kind of like your everyday swords, right? Okay, that was excellent. Could I get A, B, C, D for physician-assisted suicide in this political cartoon?
So like the issue that's talking about is like is physician-assisted suicide like okay?
Okay, so the issue here is euthanasia acceptable and or should it be legal?
And then like what is the argument's point is like she's saying that it's not natural, but then like her husband or whatever is like living off machines, which isn't necessarily natural either.
Right, so the controversy asks, what is best for the patient or person in pain who may be using technology to survive as opposed to technology to die. We will continue this conversation first thing tomorrow. Your reading assignment is 10 through 22. I will put it up on Schoology with a GIF.